The least developed countries are a group of countries that have been classified by the United Nations as least developed in terms of low gross national income, their weak human assets, and their high degree of economic valuability. Specific groups we're going to mention are not representative to whole LDC group, but we have chosen Mali, Solomon Islands, Haiti, and Asia including Nepal and Yemen.
Many LDCs rely on natural resources to survive, meaning we have needed to overfish our waters, cut down our forests, and exploit our natural environments. The removal of trees not only raises greenhouse gas emissions and displaces wildlife, but leads to soil erosion, which is already a problem due to rising sea levels and flooding. Our low economic capacity also lends itself to the use of coal and wood fuels by the general population, as eco-friendly alternatives are unavailable to most. Although we have had to make difficult choices to support ourselves, our actions have had little effect compared to the actions of more developed nations whose massive industries are wreaking havoc on our planet.
"34 African nations make up the majority of the 49 least developed countries. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports in 2007, 11 and 12 have stated that Africa is the most vulnerable continent. Climate change leads to extremes in weather and events such as drought, floods, sea level rise and storm surges, amongst many other hazards. Exacerbating these risks within Africa are specific demographic trends and widespread environmental degradation, which further magnify climate change hazards. Within Africa, the Republic of Mali has a population of 14 million people, with 80% of its labour force engaged in agriculture. Main products are cotton, cereals, vegetables, peanuts and livestock. We have 48% of our population living in poverty and only 4% of our land is arable, which is subject to further reduction through desertification of our soil. We are a vulnerable nation with a low resource capacity to implement the necessary adjustments required due to climate change and related environmental degradation. Southern Mali holds 50% of our cultivable land and 45% of our income comes through agricultural activity. Farming is of huge importance to our nation and is essential to our food security. Observations at two meteorological stations in southern Mali, Ntala and Sikasso, from 1965 to 2005 show an annual temperature increase of 0.5% per decade. Rainfall decreased markedly between 1968 to 1997, ranging between 15% and 40% compared to the period 1931 to 1960. Allied to temperature increase and rainfall decrease, we have seen a significant rise in dry spells during the rainy season over the period 1965 to 2005. This has a major negative impact on production, most prominently seen in cotton yields, which is our main export. This highlights the most important characteristic of the direct effects of climate change in southern Mali. These clear markers of climate change provide further uncertainty to our rainfall patterns and increase the need for innovative adaptation techniques. One of the key limitations in estimating the cost of adaptation in Mali is the uncertainty surrounding our adaptive capacity, admittedly due to a lack of environmental expertise within. These constraints, determined by our complex set of social, economic and institutional factors, affect our adaptive capacity and increase the need for a collaborative global response to help us adapt.
So I represent the least developed countries in the Asian region. These include Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, Cambodia, East Timor, Laos, Myanmar, Nepal and Yemen. And like all LDCs, they have had very low impact and contribution to climate change, and yet are some of the most vulnerable, arguably the most vulnerable. LDCs are so small that they are insignificant on a political scale. They really have little influence and contribution globally, so this makes it harder for them to be heard and prioritised. Severe extremes in weather patterns affect the entire hydrosphere, atmosphere, lithosphere, biosphere and entire planetary systems. And ENSO, the El Niño Southern Oscillation, is the most important zonal transfer of weather patterns, and it affects 2/3 of the Earth. Highly variable and vulnerable to global warming, El Niño and La Niña are the names given to wetter and drier periods in time, and climate change is the driving force of these patterns becoming irregular and unpredictable. In Asia, particularly, this is an issue because there are wet monsoon seasons and dry seasons, as we know, and these natural cycles are under serious threat due to climate changes. The major threat in the Asian-Pacific region is drought. The physical devastation of drought in these areas is extensive. Least developed countries are becoming the worst sufferer of the impacts due to physical, social and economic, as well as knowledge and skills differences. Drought is also responsible for increasing pollution, pests and diseases, and forced migration and famine, all which are prevalent issues in Asia as it is. South and Southeast Asian LDCs like Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Cambodia and Laos under the monsoon climactic zone have also been suffering from increasing droughts arising out of delayed and changing distribution patterns of rainfall. So when La Niña is stronger and it's drier, prolonged dry spells increase the frequencies of wildfire in grasslands, forests and rangelands. So as droughts are exacerbating, the consequences are accelerating. Yemen is the only LDC in the Middle East. It's one of the poorest countries, and about 22 million people have been struck by severe droughts and depleted water supplies in recent years. Yemenis receiving less than 200 metres of water per person a year, well below the international water poverty line of 1,000 metres, clarifies the severity of droughts and the water crisis of the country. In Yemen, the drought has caused displacement of thousands of people from mountain villages. Bangladesh droughts affect plant growth, loss of crop production, food shortages and starvation. Drought-affected households of the northern part of Bangladesh are severely affected, and households belonging to the lower socio-economic group suffered the most. And upstream water withdrawal by India is the main factor, and during the dry monsoon, and that contributed to their water shortage, and is a clear indication of how the least developed countries are at a disadvantage. On the other extreme, glacier melting leads to an increase in water discharge, which is expected to increase the frequency of catastrophic flooding events, such as glacier lake outburst floods, or GLOF for short. These events can have devastating consequences to infrastructure like bridges, dams and powerhouses, and communities living downstream. In fact, Nepal have recently started to drain their lakes to lessen the chances of outburst flooding. So the major restriction for most of Asia in response to climate change and climate action is financial. Economic and social boundaries mean there just isn't enough resources for the locals to make a difference. However, there are many programs and initiatives occurring under the UNDP, the United Nations Development Programme, which will be discussed further later on. Economic and social boundaries mean there just isn't enough resources for the locals to make a difference.
The Pacific Ocean is home to 4 LDC islands: Kiribati, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, and the Solomon Islands. Our economies are driven by our production of natural resources, with industries including fishing, agriculture, timber, mining, and tourism. However, these industries run on a minuscule scale compared to those of developed nations, so many Pacific LDCs also rely on international assistance in the form of trust funds or selling licenses to our resources. Our countries may all be different, but we all share the geographical classification of island. Our land-to-shore ratio is much higher than other continental nations, or even larger islands, so our rising sea levels pose the most risk to us. With this, we are caught in a vicious cycle. The higher oceans rise, the more we need to do to finance adaptation using practices, namely deforestation and fishing, that only contribute more to the problem. Just last week, the Solomon Islands lost 5 islands to rising sea levels, along with severe erosion of 6 more, displacing families and destroying 300 years' worth of tropical vegetation. It has been shown that islands can naturally adapt to rising sea levels, but only when the oceans are rising at the global average of 3 millimeters a year. The sea level surrounding the Solomon Islands, however, is rising at 3 times that. Our political structures largely resemble those of developed nations like Australia and the United States, albeit on a much smaller scale. Because of our small population size and the general lack of formal political parties, our elected leaders tend to be highly representative of the population. However, our small size also means that we do not hold much influence over other nations and are sometimes seen as charity cases because we rely on larger countries like Australia, New Zealand, and Japan to keep our economies afloat.
I represent the least developed countries in North America, focusing on Haiti. The country is located on the island of Hispaniola in the Greater Antilles archipelago of Caribbean. Many countries are at risk from the effects of climate change, and especially small islands are widely considered to be among the most vulnerable. Haiti is vulnerable to climate change as a result of the significant environmental degradation caused by over-exploitation of forest resources, soils, water, quarries, and coastal waters. This degradation reduces the country's ability to absorb the effects of extreme weather events and appearance of climate change. Haiti's climate have changed over the past 4 decades. Annual mean temperatures have risen, and the rainy season now begins up to 3 months later than usual. Predictions of future climate change shows that annual mean temperatures will continue to rise over the course of the 21st century. Changeability of rainfall is also expected to increase, which means more intense droughts in dry season and more harsh rainfalls in wet season. Haiti lies directly in path of hurricane corridor and is topped every rainy season by tropical storms that destroy the country's crops as well as loss of livestock and human lives. Although the effects of climate change on hurricanes and cyclones are ambiguous, models generally find an increased harshness of tropical storms in a warmer climate. Increased in intensity means both stronger winds and more rainfall in a given storm. This led to flooding and erosion, the impacts of which are amplified by serious environmental degradation and is very likely attributable to climate change. Flooding is a major problem in almost all of Haiti's 30 major watersheds. Because of extreme seasonal rainfall, storm surges in coastal zones, and deforested and destroyed landscape. During the tropical storm and hurricane season, as much as 40 millimeters of rain may fall each day. This leads to rapid runoff from deforested or small round mountains and hills, as well as the overtopping of rivers. Because of lack of tree cover and steep slopes, the series of hurricanes caused considerable losses of soil, crops, livestock, and rural roads, which results reducing access to fields and making produce transportation difficult.
Quite simply, the solution to climate change is reducing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. The Earth cannot warm more than 2 degrees Celsius without absolutely catastrophic consequences. This requires a serious shift in focus to renewable energy and significant cuts to carbon pollution. The solution to climate change is the biggest challenge humans face, and While the problem itself is crucial, there is also a lot happening to combat the effects in the form of adaptation and mitigation.
We align ourselves with Greenpeace and other environmental NGOs and seek further cooperation from clean energy industries in supplying technologies where most needed, due to our current low capacity to implement a decarbonised society. Business and industry non-government organisations and large CO2 emitters are undoubtedly to blame for placing in jeopardy the way of life for hundreds of millions of people. The Green Climate Fund, and specifically the Least Developed Countries Fund and Special Climate Change Fund, provides a proactive method for tackling the vast challenge of adapting to a changing climate, but a scaling up of fund pledges is needed. As of April 2016, 10.6 billion had been pledged to the GCF, falling far short of the intended target funding of 100 billion per year by 2020. Allied to the required monetary resource to implement adaptation, a coordinated effort utilising advanced methodology and technology from developed countries is required. Through the Global Environmental Facility, working with environmental NGOs and the private sector, it is clear to see that we have in place a coordinated task force, but without the funding, LDC government and its people will continue to struggle. Whilst the continued slow uptake in pledges remains, the opportunity sits wasted for local, low-resource governments to educate and enact direct changes to techniques and also to long-term changes on a societal level through working collaboratively with stakeholders in implementing long-term, clean, efficient and decarbonised technologies. To finish, on the subject of mitigation, we cannot endorse current emission levels or even targeted reductions. Our request is for a rapid escalation in the elimination of carbon emissions worldwide. The global mindset must change. Even within the Green Climate Fund, projects utilising fossil fuels can still be endorsed. This is exasperating for all LDCs and its people who see their livelihoods, homes and communities being placed into further risk. These people, as part of a global community, must become the principal concern when addressing the issue of climate change, rather than the current preoccupation within developed governments towards the industrial, profit-driven continuation of burning fossil fuels to meet energy demands.